Welcome to those of you joining us on YouTube. This is the impeachment of Andrew Johnson with our speaker, Heather Dudley. It is being brought to you by Osher Lifelong Learning at George Mason. If you have an interest in OLLI, please visit our website at olli.gmu.edu. Thank you. Okay, Heather.
All right, and welcome back everybody to session 4, our last session on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Hold on to your seats because we've got some crazy things happening in this year that we are going to be digging into 1868. The country is really just flying apart in a lot of different directions, and of course this is the context for impeachment that we need to understand. Why was it that the Republicans were going to be bringing the impeachment against Andrew Johnson? And as we've seen, we've already been through 2 attempts at impeachment. Today we'll go through impeachment number 3 and impeachment number 4. So in order to understand this, as I've emphasized all along, we really do need to get into the context of what's going on. First of all, in the South, you have radical Reconstruction is underway. You know, Americans have always been suspicious of the federal government playing too large of a role in the roles of this state. However, self-reconstruction in the South, it really didn't seem to have been going very well. You know, they'd pass those black codes, which seemed intent upon pushing the freedmen back into a new type of slavery. So the Republicans in Congress had imposed radical Reconstruction, the Reconstruction Act, and that had divided the southern states, divided the entire South up into 5 military districts. And they, the federal troops were there protecting the freed slaves and running the elections. And in these elections, the black men were voting, and the high-ranking rebel leaders were not voting. And you know, if you went back to, if you were to time machine back to the South during this time, the late 1860s, early 1870s, well, you know, you would think that you were visiting a foreign country, because they were electing black leaders into their state legislatures and as well as into Congress. That picture there on the right, that's the South Carolina legislature, state legislature. South Carolina, the hotbed of secession, the home of John C. Calhoun, the father of secession. They have a majority of black representatives in their state legislature. And then the states are also electing blacks to the House of Representatives and to the Senate. That's a picture of John Willis Maynard, who actually in 1865 was elected to the House of Representatives. At that time, they weren't quite ready to seat a black man, and they didn't let him take his seat, but would change. Here's a picture of and the dates of when the first black representatives arrived in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. These southern states were writing the most progressive constitutions of the day. For example, the South Carolina Constitution enfranchised black men, abolished debtors' prison, provided for integrated public schools, abolished the property qualification for office holding, established schools for deaf and blind, and there were no bans against interracial marriage. How about the Louisiana Constitution? Also enfranchised the freedmen, disenfranchised the ex-rebels, established integrated public schools, and guaranteed property rights for some married women. This was happening all over the South in these state constitutions. That most particularly, they were extending the vote to Black men and establishing integrated public schools. And as we all know, we all lived happily and harmoniously ever after. What a wonderful story. Well, no, actually, as you know, it didn't turn out like that, because at the same time, there was this growing backlash against what was happening in the South. For many of the white folks in the South, not happy about those slaves having been freed in the first place. And now it was their nightmare was coming true. This catastrophic turn of events where Blacks were being elected into leadership positions. And this was fueling just a tremendous amount of craziness and violence. The KKK was growing. Other white terrorist organizations were growing. That these committees were bound and determined to end the direction that the Southern states were going into. After all, you know, these racist attitudes that had justified slavery, you know, they don't just fall away like apples off of a tree, right? And so they remain, and it's truly just this fear of change. In Tennessee alone, 40,000 members of the KKK. Blacks throughout the South, although there were federal troops guaranteeing their vote, so many of them said, as this Black man said, he saw so many men stabbed, knocked down, and beaten up on election day that I threw away my ballot. So in the South, though, we are spinning off in these two crazy different directions. And then, of course, in the federal government here, you have Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat who continues to rail against the Republican Congress. He continues to say that it's an illegitimate Congress because they will not seat Southern representatives. He's constantly launching these crazy speeches that are firing up the hatred and racism. And he also would not negotiate with Congress. And you have an overwhelming Republican majority in Congress and veto-proof majority in Congress, and he will not negotiate with them. So in the South, thousands, and that's not an exaggerated number, thousands of Blacks are being killed, as well as their white Republican supporters. And so this is the backdrop of what is happening with these impeachment efforts. So let's move on into impeachment round 3. Now, for those of you who know something about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, you'll probably be wondering, well, when are we going to talk about this Tenure of Office Act passed back in 1867? And this is a rather dully titled piece of legislation, and it was in response to the fact that Andrew Johnson was firing a lot of the Republicans that disagreed with him and was replacing them with more compliant Democrats. And well, you might think that's reasonable. After all, a president has the right to have people surrounding him who support his viewpoint. The problem is that for the Republicans, he's an illegitimate president. This was supposed to be Lincoln's Republican administration. This was not supposed to be the administration of a states' rights Southern Democrat. So they had passed this Tenure of Office Act to protect the Republicans in office. And in essence, what it said was that any federal official whose appointment had required Senate confirmation could not be removed without the consent of the Senate. Questionable constitutionality of this. In fact, in later years, the Supreme Court will rule that officials that do require Senate confirmation is not required for the president to remove them. Thaddeus Stevens, who played a role in writing this piece of legislation, he was so smart. He included as a clause in the Tenure of Office Act that violation of this act was a high misdemeanor. So we just need to, as you can see, you know, we just have the Republicans. We've got to get rid of this man. We just need a reason. We just need a good enough reason. So we move into impeachment round 3. Andrew Johnson has good reason to distrust his Secretary of War, Stanton. Stanton was not really being straightforward with Andrew Johnson. He was being dishonest with Andrew Johnson. He was saying one thing to Johnson and reporting back other things to his Republican friends in Congress. So actually, Johnson had good reason to want to remove Stanton as Secretary of War. So on August of 1867, he sends this little note to Stanton: public considerations of a high character constrain me to say that your resignation of Secretary of War will be accepted. And then Stanton, sort of tartly and sarcastically, responds: public considerations of a high character constrain me not to resign the office of Secretary of War before the next meeting of Congress. So the idea here is that, and this is Johnson's idea. He thinks that I've got it. I know how to work around this Tenure of Office Act. He said, first of all, this is only a temporary suspension, so I'm not really violating the act. And after all, you know, he couldn't trust Stanton, so Stanton needs to go. And then Johnson said, well, I am going to appoint the most popular man in America at this point, Ulysses Grant, to be the interim Secretary of War. And of course, the Senate and everybody will just applaud this move because everybody loves Grant, and in this wonderful, we'll get Grant to be the Secretary of War. Johnson also, he thinks that might also weaken Grant's presidential prospects. Because this will make it look like Grant is in Johnson's pocket, and as Secretary of War, he'll be able to manipulate him. And so that's Johnson's plan, that he thinks that he can manipulate Ulysses Grant. He obviously didn't know Grant very, very well. So basically, this is what happens, and it gets a little bit complicated here about who said to what, when, and how they said it, and what they meant, and what was interpreted, what was remembered, and so on and so forth. But Grant, he accepts this position as the interim Secretary of War. But then he takes a closer look at that Tenure of Office Act, and he thinks, okay, if I am sitting here as the interim Secretary of War, and if the Senate then, when they reconvene, if they vote to keep Stanton, then, and if I'm still here, what that might mean is that I am going to be fined and imprisoned. And I don't think Grant was feeling too happy about spending a lot of time sitting in prison at this point in his life. Now, Johnson, meanwhile, says to Grant, and again, there's some conflict about actually who said what when. Johnson says, listen, if the Senate doesn't uphold your suspension, then promise me that you will stay as the interim secretary. And you just sit there and you just cool your jets while we wait for this law to then go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will rule on its constitutionality. And then Grant, he says, oh, don't worry. If you get stuck in jail, I'll pay your fine and we'll get you out and everything will be okay. Or Johnson says, if you're not willing to do this, then just do me a favor, let me know, resign as the interim secretary, and I will appoint somebody else. So again, if you got this, it's kind of like, if you do this, then I'll do that, but you got to do this and make these promises to me. It's a little bit confusing. Anyway, Grant stays in as the interim secretary. So Johnson thinks, okay, everything's cool between us here. And well, what happens now is that the Senate comes back into session, and they do not uphold the suspension. That they say, no, Stanton is still the Secretary of War. And in the meantime, and this is what sort of upsets Johnson about Grant, very quickly, he turns over the office keys back to Stanton, and he is out of there really quick. Now, Johnson, of course, feels betrayed by Grant. That wasn't what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to stay in the office, and we were going to wait this out together. This is really sort of the beginning of the end with the relationship between Grant and Johnson. So now Thaddeus Stevens here, he says, okay, I think we got it. I think this is it. I think this is the cause for impeachment we have. So Thaddeus Stevens says to his committee, he says, let's immediately begin impeachment proceedings. He says that this attempt to remove Stanton and to keep Grant there, that this was a conspiracy to obstruct justice. And the committee votes on it. And how does the vote come out? The subcommittee votes against proceeding. I hope you can see here that although there is no love for Andrew Johnson, there is a real fear to use impeachment, to pull this powerful weapon out of their arsenal and to bring impeachment proceedings against Johnson. Stevens at this point sort of throws up his hands and he says, there is no sense making ourselves ridiculous before the country, and he drops the effort. So they want very much to impeach this man. They don't yet quite know how to do it, but leave it to Johnson. Johnson's gonna help them out. Meanwhile, of course, Mark Twain, who is living in Washington and observing Congress and writing newspaper columns about what's going on, and he said, died in this city, February 13th, at his lodging in the chamber of the House Reconstruction Committee, our beloved brother Impeachment. The malady of the diseased was general debility. Honorable Thaddeus Stevens, the bravest old ironclad in the Capitol, fought hard for impeachment, even when he saw that it could not succeed. The old ironclad had called Congress a pack of damned cowards, the finest word that any congressional topic has produced this session. And then also, of course, in a newspaper article written at this time in the editorial in the New York Independent, no more truthful words could be said as far as, what is an impeachable offense. If the great culprit had robbed a till, if he fired a barn, if he had forged a check, he would have been indicted, prosecuted, condemned, sentenced, and punished. But the evidence shows that he only oppressed the Negro, that he only conspired with the rebel, that he only betrayed the Union, that he only attempted to overthrow the Republic. Of course, he goes unwhipped by justice. So what are we going to do? Well, leave it to Johnson. He's going to give us something we can really dig our teeth into as far as impeachment. And it all begins with a problem that he has with William Tecumseh Sherman. Johnson, for reasons of his own, decides to create this new military division of the Atlantic. There was no necessity for this. Nobody really understood why he was going to do this. And he wanted Sherman to be in charge. Now, remember that Johnson has already threatened to use the military against Congress in some of his speeches. So some rumors begin to swirl around. Well, this is his plan, that he plans on creating this military division. It's going to be headquartered right there in Washington with none other than Sherman in charge. And so that is really the fear. Now Sherman is, he's an odd fellow, let's face it. And Johnson had actually been calling on Sherman on numerous occasions to ask for his advice, that he never followed. He also seemed to believe that Sherman was a really good friend of his, which of course he was not. And Sherman had to say this about Johnson: he is like a general fighting without an army. He is like Lear roaring at the wild storm, bareheaded and helpless. And now he wants me to go with him into the wilderness. Sherman actually also believed that perhaps this is what Johnson was plotting. That he thought if he could get Sherman in charge, and Sherman was his friend, and the two of them would bring a coup against Congress. Again, Johnson does not clearly know Sherman too well. For a number of reasons, Sherman was going to turn this down. One, it would have given him a rank equal to Grant, and he would never do that. And then also, he would have to live in Washington, and Sherman didn't like Washington. He had said at one point, if I had to choose between living in Washington or the penitentiary, I'd choose the penitentiary. He also saw his friend Grant, that Grant, his battle-hardened, unflappable friend Grant, he had never seen him as upset by the goings on in Washington, with all the backstabbing and double dealing that he had to deal with. And he said that if this political atmosphere can destroy the equanimity of one so guarded and as Grant, what will be the result with one so careless and outspoken as I am? So turns him down. This might have just triggered some sort of a temper tantrum now in Andrew Johnson, because he decides that Stanton is the problem. And he doesn't consult with his cabinet, and he doesn't consult with any of his aides. And this time he outright fires Stanton. No temporary suspension, waiting for Congress to come back. He fires Stanton. And at this point, this whole situation really takes on the flavor of a comedic opera. Now, I have included here, not too long of a passage, tried to edit it down a little bit, Johnson's explanation for why he needed to fire Stanton. And I think you'll see that it's reasonable. He says, as time passed on, there was developed an unfortunate difference of opinion upon the question of Negro suffrage. The subsequent sessions of Congress developed new complications when the suffrage bill for the District of Columbia and the Reconstruction Acts all passed over the veto. It was in cabinet consultations upon these bills that a difference of opinion upon the most vital points was developed. Upon these questions, there was perfect accord between all the members of the cabinet and myself, except Mr. Stanton. He stood alone, and the difference of opinion that could not be reconciled, that unity of opinion, which upon great questions of public policy or administration is so essential to the executive, was gone. And then he says, you know, through history, presidents have been able to fill their cabinet with the officers of their choosing. So why should things change for him? When the opinions of a head of department are irreconcilably opposed to those the president in grave matters of policy administration, there is but one result which can solve the difficulty, and that is the severance of the official relationship. This is the past history of the government. Indeed, it has always been the rule, and it is a wise one. For such differences of opinion among its members must impair the efficiency of any administration. So Stanton is fired. Some would argue this is very reasonable for him to want to have friendly cabinet officers, but at least finally the Republicans have their violation of law, even though it wasn't a very good law that he violated. So this is where it turns into a comedy. So his first go around, he tried to use the ramrod Ulysses Grant to remove Stanton, and that didn't work. So now he's going to select this very weak reed among some very weak reeds, Lorenzo Thomas, to do his bidding against Stanton. Said of Lorenzo Thomas, he was loyal mainly to his desk, his epaulets, and his alcohol. So on Friday, February 21st, Andrew Johnson, he calls on Thomas and he says, well, you are my new Secretary of War, congratulations. And he sends him off to Stanton's office to tell Stanton to clear out and hand over the keys. And Thomas does that. And he walks into the office and Stanton says to him, do you wish me to vacate at once, or am I to be permitted to stay long enough to remove my property? So in other words, can I have a weekend to clean out my desk? By the way, we have this record of who said exactly what, because Thomas wrote a very detailed memos about his conversations. And there were also other people who were recording this conversation. So it's great fun that we have this back and forth between these two. So anyway, Stanton says, just give me the weekend to clean things up. And so Johnson tells Stanton, he says, okay, that's fine. You can have the weekend. I'll be back on Monday. So Stanton immediately informs the House that he had been fired. Now, Thomas goes back to Johnson and he says, okay, I was there. I gave him your message. And he asked if he could have the weekend. And I said that was okay. Well, Johnson was irate at this. He says, no, that wasn't the plan. He says, I need you to take control of that office right now. So you go back tomorrow morning and you take the keys to the office and you get Stanton out of there. Well, that, by the way, is Tommy Lee Jones, who I told you about already in the movie Lincoln, who did a fabulous job with Thaddeus Stevens. So anyway, this is Thaddeus Stevens here, played by Tommy Lee Jones, who says, didn't I tell you? What good did your moderation do? If you don't kill the beast, it will kill you. And so he very quickly hurries through impeachment resolutions through his committee. And the full House is set to vote then on the following Monday. So we have a really, really busy weekend ahead of us. Of course, Stanton now is told by the Republicans, he said, resist by force, do not leave the office. And they have a battalion is stationed outside of the of his office, which at that time was housed in the old executive office building. And Stanton sets up a cot and he's not going to leave, and he's going to take his meals and he's going to sleep in his office, which actually he does. Stanton does not leave his office. He sleeps in his office and he eats in his office right on through the trial and for many months. Now, Stanton is not a healthy man, and this is not actually a very good thing for him to be doing. At one point, supposedly his wife showed up outside of the old executive office building, demanding that, you know, he come home at once and stop all this silliness and have a good meal and sleep in his own bed. Well, he said, no, sorry, I can't do that. And so he stays on, barricaded in his office throughout all of this. So he stays in his office, and the Senate holds a vote very quickly. They hold this vote and they say that indeed his removal was unconstitutional. So we're moving forward. Now, as if things weren't busy enough this weekend, Lorenzo Thomas, he decides to attend a masquerade ball where he has much too much to drink. And the next day, he is seen walking the streets of Washington, very drunk, and bragging about everything that he's going to do. And he's going to go to the office and he's going to remove Stanton by force. And if Stanton locks the door, he's going to break the door down. And he's just all full of himself. Unfortunately, Stanton had issued a warrant for his arrest, and the drunk Thomas is arrested at 9 o'clock in the morning and thrown into jail. Johnson very quickly makes sure that his bail is posted and he is out of jail. So now the hungover Lorenzo Thomas, who is now being referred to as Lorenzo the Magnificent, he heads off back to the War Department to see if he can't remove Stanton from the office. And again, bizarre, and this all comes from Lorenzo Thomas's notes about what happened. So Saturday afternoon, Thomas shows back up in the office, and this is what Thomas says. I said, the next time you have me arrested, please do not do it before I get something to eat. I said I had nothing to eat or drink all day. I mean, honestly, how can you be arrested before you get your first drink of the day? He put his hand around my neck, as he sometimes does, and ran his hand through my hair and turned around to General Shriver and said, Shriver, you have a bottle here, bring it out, pouring drinks. Stanton said, now this at least is neutral ground. I mean, can you just picture this? You know, here's Stanton with his arm around Thomas, kind of tousling his hair, saying, you know, it's okay, let's just have a drink. And Thomas complaining about the fact that he'd be arrested before he had anything to drink or eat that day. And please don't do that again. They have actually a very nice conversation. And Stanton reminded Thomas of an assignment that he had given Thomas, something to do with cataloging Civil War cemetery, something along those lines. And Thomas said, "Oh yeah, okay, I'll get right back to that." So Thomas leaves the office. After all, he'd had his first drink of the day, and he reports back to Johnson, and Johnson is not happy, and he says, "Go back and take possession of the office." However, Thomas complained, he didn't tell me exactly how I am to do that, because Stanton has locked the door and they have a battalion out on the streets preventing Thomas from entering the building. And that is where things stand. Rumors wild through the streets, that this is the same as Napoleon here, that we have a coup against the government. Wild rumors in the streets about what is happening here. People are saying that well, it hasn't been as crazy since, well, the assassination of Lincoln or the secession of South Carolina. Newspapers, this is an example of some of the things that were being printed in the newspapers. And then also the senators were being pelted by telegrams from their constituents about what is going on. The bloodied and untilled fields of the 10 unreconstructed states, the unsheeted ghosts of the 2,000 murdered Negroes in Texas cry for the punishment of Andrew Johnson. The uproar was equal to that which followed the assassination of President Lincoln. And yes, it was rumored that some of the Union veterans were forming themselves into militia units, and that they were prepared to march the streets, to march onto Washington to protect the Congress from Andrew Johnson. This is my favorite quote of all from Mark Twain. He said, "Sound the tocsin. I don't know what a tocsin is, but I want it sounded all the same." So we're sounding the tocsin, whatever that is. So impeachment, round 4. We are there, folks. I told you we'd get there, and we are there. This is the one that's actually going to work. So the full House votes, and they vote yes on impeachment, as Thaddeus Stevens, who is really not very well, but he is rallying for this event. And he said God would hold them responsible for their votes, and that they were at this moment choosing between a country filled with free and untrammeled people, or one that was a nest of shrinking, cowardly slaves. Every Republican voted yes, and every voted no. So Thaddeus Stevens, he takes his impeachment papers and he walks over to the Senate and he delivers them to the Senate. He says that the president is guilty of as atrocious attempts to usurp the liberty and destroy the happiness of this nation as were ever perpetrated by the most detestable tyrant who ever oppressed his fellow men. Now, this is an interesting moment here because you might recall that with Trump's impeachment 2.0, that his defense attorneys, that they complained that Trump had been denied his due process as the articles of impeachment worked their way through the House. And they argued that he had a right to due process in the House only because that has really become what's expected. In Clinton's impeachment and also Trump's first impeachment, the House did spend many, many weeks collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses. However, Andrew Johnson, he didn't get a long drawn out due process proceeding. And this is the most interesting thing because they don't have any specifics yet. They say, we'll get back to you in due time. This is basically a grand jury saying, oh, he's a criminal, but we'll get back to you about what crimes that he has committed. You haven't quite figured that one out yet. So they deliver this to the Senate, and then the House gets back to work. Mark Twain said of Thaddeus Stevens, there was a soul in his sunken eyes, but otherwise he was a corpse that was ready for the shroud. He held his precious impeachment papers in his hand, signed at last in the 11th hour. His coveted triumph had come. And indeed, newspaper articles, there were journalists who were constantly reporting about the appearance of Thaddeus Stevens as his health was rapidly declining. So the impeachment managers, they do get back to writing up their articles of impeachment, and they write up 11 articles of impeachment. The first 9 are very, very detailed, very repetitive, that they all pertain to his violation of the Tenure of Office Act. These made it seemed to make it clear that this is going to be a criminal prosecution, and we're going to point out all of these many different ways that he violated the law here. Article 9, one way that he had violated the law wasn't just the Tenure of Office Act, but the Military Appropriations Act that had been passed by Congress over Johnson's veto had told the military commanders in the South that they were to not take orders from Johnson, but they were only to take orders from Grant. And Johnson then issued orders to these military commanders that in fact they were not to be taking their orders from Grant, that they must take their orders from and report only to Johnson. So he had violated 2 pieces of legislation. As editorial in The Nation said, Johnson was impeached because he had finally committed a distinct and palpable violation of the law. Praise the Lord. The firing of Stanton was not by any ways the worst of a moral point of view. So that's maybe going to be our problem. We have this awful man who should not be president, but gosh, you know, he did violate a law, but it's kind of a shaky one. And are we really going to be able to carry this one off? So this is a picture of the impeachment papers being delivered to Andrew Johnson. So Articles 10 and Articles 11, it gets to be a little bit broader here, the attack on Johnson here. Article 10, it was all about these awful, insulting speeches that he had given. In this article, they include quotations from his speeches, and this was evidence that the president, unmindful of the high duties of this high office and dignity and proprieties thereof, and of the harmony and courtesies which ought to exist and be maintained between the executive and legislative branches, did attempt to bring into disgrace, ridicule, hatred, contempt, and reproach the Congress of the United States. Sounds familiar, does it not? Article 11, this was really the brainchild of Thaddeus Stevens here. And this article lumps a whole bunch of charges into one article. It summarized Johnson's presidency as violating the Constitution, failing to faithfully execute the laws, conspiracy, usurpation, and the obstruction of justice. This Article 11 reminds me of the article of impeachment brought against Trump, which put a whole bunch of charges into the one article. It was, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, about inciting insurrection, and then also his inciting violence against the Congress and failing to protect the Constitution, faithfully execute the laws. So Article 11, remarkably similar to the article of impeachment brought recently against Trump. So the trial, here we go. Before we get into the trial, just want you to remember here what Hamilton had said about the impeachment process. It is a political process for removing a president through a pseudo-judicial procedure. Hamilton said, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt. I think we can all agree to that one. The process is political. It's not really criminal. It has sort of the air of a criminal trial, but it is not. It is a political process. So, the trial. There are 54 senators that are currently seated in the Senate. We need 36 to convict. There are 42 Republicans. There are 12 Democrats. All we need to do is hold the Republicans. All we really need to do is to make sure that 7 Republicans don't bolt the party and vote for acquittal. That's all we need. Seems pretty easy. That we have more than the 2/3 needed for a conviction. So there we have a cartoon of Andrew Johnson here conferring with the ghosts of King Charles I and King Louis the 16th, who also been removed from office. Public opinion wildly favored removal from office. There was no doubt about that. Again, the folks in the North had been observing what had been happening in the South and observing this escalating violence against the freedmen in the South, and of course shocked by these vulgar, outrageous speeches that Johnson has given, where he has been threatening violence against members of Congress, insinuating that he could use the military against Congress if they didn't go his way. Ulysses Grant, he came out and he said that national security demanded Johnson's immediate removal. In the Chicago Tribune, it was like an aching tooth. Everyone is impatient to have the old villain out. He was, in summary, he was a threat to the nation, and he had violated the Tenure of Office Act. And these ongoing attacks on Congress were just simply unacceptable. You just simply can't have a president who will not respect the legitimacy of a sitting Congress. There were those who were against impeachment. And basically, it was, yeah, Johnson was controversial and he was out of sync with Congress. But this was not a convictable. The Tenure of Office Act is just too shaky. That Tenure of Office Act, it was unconstitutional, and that was really the only defense that was actively suggested. So let's look at the trial. We have a few personnel issues here, might you say, that are definitely going to be have an impact on the outcome of impeachment. First of all, we have Chief Justice Salmon Chase, who is, what a wonderful name, Salmon Chase, who is going to be presiding over the trial. Now, in the controversy between Grant and Johnson, Chase was definitely on Johnson's side, as he said Grant was a small man among small men. He had also indicated what his role would be. Now, you go back to the Constitution, and it's not clear what he's supposed to do as presiding officer. Is he just supposed to sit there quietly and make sure that everything is run, that it starts and it stops when it's supposed to? But instead, he comes in and he establishes the rules. This is how the trial is going to run. Now, we haven't ever had a trial before, and there were actually a lot of senators who were worried, well, what happens if Chase decides he doesn't want to show up? Does that mean we don't have a trial? Can they force him? Well, how would they force him? Okay, they could go to Chase's Supreme Court and they could have Chase tell Chase to do something that Chase doesn't want to do. So they thought, what are we going to do then? So they knew that Chase really had a position of power, and he was going to set the rules and nobody was going to question him. It was like, okay, Chase, whatever you want to do, just so long as you will show up and preside over this trial. The first thing that Chase says is he says that if there is ever a tie vote, I am going to vote. I will cast a vote. He also indicated that that the Senate was going to be organized as a court of law. So again, this is sort of indicating that this is really going to be a legal proceeding, and that's what it wants to be. And this was where it was really going to get to be really tricky. He said that he would rule on the admissibility of evidence and the reliability of any witnesses. However, if any member of the Senate disagreed with his ruling, then they could debate, and then they could have a vote, and he would let the vote stand. He would let the vote overrule him if that's the way the vote came out. Now you can see this puts the House managers in kind of a really sticky position, because anything that they want to do, well, if Chase rules against them, then the House managers, they can't do anything. They just got to sit there and they have to hope that some sympathetic senator will stand up and say, well, no, I disagree with Chase with what you just said, and so let's debate it and let's vote on it. So that already is limiting what the managers could do. So if a senator objected, a vote would be taken. The senators were a little worried about Chase and what he was going to do. Chase had already, and any other judge would certainly recuse himself under these circumstances. He had already publicly stated that he believed this impeachment of Johnson was absurd. He had already publicly stated that he believed that Johnson was within his rights to dismiss Stanton, already on the record with these statements. And it was also widely known that Chase had presidential ambitions here. Which party? Well, it's pretty clear that the Republicans are going to go with Grant. So might Chase be after the Democratic nomination for the presidency? And if that's in his mind, might he be thinking, well, you know, if I'm, you know, if this trial comes out in Johnson's favor, then I'm going to be looking really good to the Democrats. So we've got all kinds of reasons here to worry about Chase and how he's going to be conducting the trial. Another person whose presence in the room is really going to be significantly affecting the outcome of the trial is old Ben Wade, Benjamin. Before the 25th Amendment, when a vice president becomes president, we don't get a new vice president. So in the event of Johnson's removal, Ben Wade, who was the president pro tem of the Senate, he would become the president. And there were a lot of folks who were really worried about that. He was just a radical of the radicals. He was a hothead, and it was really hard to work with him. And he had a really bad temper. And so there were a lot of folks who are going, you know, I don't know, you know, Andrew Johnson, last few months of his presidency would not be nearly as bad as President Ben Wade. And then also the way politicians think. The Republicans are saying, okay, well, we need to get Grant nominated here. Now, Ben Wade, he's going to be holding the office of the presidency, and he's going to maybe be able to use his clout to weasel his way onto the ticket as the vice president. And Ben Wade is so widely hated everywhere that perhaps that would weaken Grant's chance at election. I guess that's the way politicians think. Really wasn't true, but this was said. Conviction meant a transfer to the presidency of Mr. Wade, a man of violent passions, extreme opinions, and narrow views, a man who has never studied or thought thoroughly or carefully on any subject except slavery, a grossly profane, coarse nature who was surrounded by the worst and most violent elements in the Republican Party. So you can see now that if we're going to have some waffling Republicans, that they're going to look at Wade and they're going to think, no, don't want that man in the presidency. Later on, and this is said after Johnson is acquitted, and I hope I'm not burying the headline having said that, that Andrew Johnson is innocent because Benjamin Wade was guilty. So here are our impeachment managers, really. The only ones terribly important to us is first seated on the left here, Benjamin Butler. Benjamin Butler had been a very successful trial lawyer before the Civil War. He then became one of the so-called political generals, where he was widely known for his complete lack of military skill. And then after the war, he is elected into the House of Representatives. And he is going to be the leader of the managers. Seated next to him is Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens is not looking too good, is he? Thaddeus Stevens really should be the lead manager on the team, but his health is very, very poor. He is barely able to walk, hardly able to stand. He is carried into the Congress every day on a chair, and then he's laid out on a couch covered in a blanket where he hardly moves and hardly breathes. And every day they're reporting on his imminent death. He was unable to attend all of the meetings of the House managers, which was unfortunate. In his day, he had been a brilliant debater and a brilliant trial lawyer. and probably could have done just a great job, but he was just simply too ill to participate. Um, so here's a picture of Johnson conferring with his lawyers, and there was a mixture of Republicans and Democrats. One of the biggest problems that his lawyers had was was Johnson. That Johnson just kept having interviews with journalists and just making all these crazy remarks about what's happening in the South, and just hating the idea of political equality for the blacks, and not seeming to care at all about the chaos and violence that was escalating in the South, and continuing to rail against Stanton and rail against Grant and just rail against everyone. He threatened on a number of occasions that he was going to come into the Senate and he was going to take control of the trial, and he really wanted to be a witness, unlike Trump, who didn't want to be a witness. That Johnson wanted very much to be a witness in his trial, but his lawyers knew much better than to put Johnson in there as a witness in his own trial, because, well, as a defendant, in his own trial, because of his hair trigger temper, and the possibility that he's going to just launch off into one of his crazy diatribes. So let's look at the trial. There's old Ben Butler, most unattractive man indeed here. So Ben Butler here, he opens for the prosecution, and he did love the flowery language. By murder most foul, he succeeded to the presidency and is the elect of an assassin to that high office. And he says to the senators that they have an even higher duty than finding Johnson in violation of the act. They were bound only by the natural principle of equity and justice. So I hope that what we're going to see here, as we are arguing about what is an impeachable offense, what we're still arguing about today, is it really have to be a specific law that in a criminal court that you could be found guilty of violating this law? And also, is this law of a serious enough nature that you should be removed from the highest office in the land? And Ben Butler wants to say, that's not really the essence of what's going on here. It's not just the violation of the act. And yes, he did violate that act, but there are higher principles that we are reaching for, these principles of equity and justice here. He might have been referring to, the preamble of the Constitution in order to create a more perfect union. Is Johnson's presidency contributing to that? Is it contributing to justice? Is it contributing to the common welfare? Is it contributing to the common defense? Is it making our country a better place? The facts were certainly not in dispute, and in the trial, the facts were never really heavily disputed here. He emphasizes, though, this question of what is an impeachable misdemeanor. And he said, well, it's really any act that flouts your official oath of office, and he certainly did seem to violate his oath of office or his duty or a law. And that he certainly did violate the law. Now, this gets to be kind of a sticky question here about the legitimacy of the Tenure of Office Act. Remember back to Impeachment Round 3, where Johnson only suspended Stanton and said, I'm going to wait for Congress to come back into session and make a determination on my suspension here, and then maybe let it go to the Supreme Court. When he did that, indicate that he recognized that it was a legitimate law when he appeared to be following the law. And so can he now say, no, it was unconstitutional, when earlier on he had seemed to be following it here? Maybe kind of a sticky legal point. So the trial. Curtis here, he is the lead defender of Trump, and he's an interesting fellow. Curtis is a former Supreme Court justice. He is the first justice to have had a law degree, and he's also the first justice to have resigned from the Supreme Court for principle. He was wrote a dissenting opinion for the Dred Scott case, and after the Dred Scott case, he resigned from the Supreme Court. His opening, he says that party spirit, political schemes, foregone conclusions, outrageous biases, they can have no fit operation. Yeah, well, what are the chances, right? But they can't, they shouldn't. And he does sort of agree. He says, you know, Johnson might not be a great man, but he is not a bad man. He says that he is honest, right-minded, but narrow-minded. He has no tact and even lacks discretion and forecasting. Again, I'm sure those defenders of Trump said the same things about him. And then as far as those first 8 articles go, he said that Johnson did not violate the Tenure of Office Act because it did not apply to Stanton. He had been appointed by Lincoln. This is another kind of a sticky legal issue with this Tenure of Office Act. You know, there were actually 2 different versions of the act. One went through the House and one went through the Senate. So it's kind of hard to tell for sure, but it did seem to say that, that this only applied to the cabinet officers that had been appointed by the president. So Lincoln appointed Stanton. So only Lincoln could have, you know, fired Stanton and needed to have the Senate confirmation to have gotten rid of Stanton. Now, because Lincoln isn't there and because it's now Johnson, Johnson is never the one who had appointed Stanton in the first place. So kind of tricky here about whether or not this did indeed apply to Johnson. But the argument to that is that, well, you know, Johnson, he seemed to be agreeing with the legitimacy of the law all along. So it does apply to Johnson, because once Johnson then assumed the presidency, and he continued to work with Stanton as his Secretary of War. So it did apply, but Curtis is saying that it didn't. And then this is the other interesting argument, that he says, you know, Johnson is as obligated as any of us to protect the Constitution. In his oath of office, he swears to uphold the Constitution. So if he sees that there is an unconstitutional law, it is his duty to test that law, and that he had only violated the act because he had hoped that it would go before the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court could rule on it, and then we could move forward. So in response to Curtis's argument, this is what was said. Okay, the president either did or did not violate the bill. Mr. Curtis makes out that 1, he did not violate it. 2, he set out to violate it and did violate, but that in so doing, he acted with the best intentions. I leave to someone more clever than I the task of finding the connection between these 2 propositions. So we got a real kind of sticky, hair-splitting legal argument going on in the trial. So Curtis continues and he says, okay, treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, what does that exactly mean here? Well, treason and bribery, well, we all know what those are, and there's a reason why the framers put treason and bribery in there, because a president who is committing either treason or bribery, well, that strikes at the very existence of our government. So those must be impeachable offenses. So what about high crimes and misdemeanors? Well, what exactly does that mean? And I'm going to, mangle my Latin pronunciation here. Nocitur associs. It is known by friends. Curtis says that the meaning of unclear words should be determined by considering the words with which they are associated. So these words, high crimes and misdemeanors, are associated in the same sentence with violations that are so severe that that they do strike at the existence of government. So what we need is that we need to have the violation of a law that is as catastrophic to the workings of government as would be treason or bribery. This, by the way, does establish a very important precedence here, what Curtis has done with his definition of high crimes and misdemeanors. Ever since Curtis made this argument in Andrew Johnson's trial, this has really been sort of the direction that, that interpretations of high crimes and misdemeanors has gone to. So a high crime or misdemeanor has to be a violation of a law so bad that it belongs with treason and bribery. So, Tenure of Office Act doesn't rank up there. It does not rank up there with treason and bribery. It's not, whether or not, Stanton is Secretary of War. I mean, really, who cares? Then he goes on to that Article 10, Johnson's intemperate speeches. Well, what about those? The House of Representatives has erected itself into a school of manners, erecting from its ranks those gentlemen whom it deems most competent by precept and example to teach decorum of speech. And they desire the judgment of this body, whether the president has not been guilty of indecorum, whether he has spoken properly, to use the phrase of an honorable manner. So what if you make some intemperate speeches? What do we care? Anyway, the trial, people showed up for this trial really expecting that we were going to get some important issues addressed about, the status of the South and the role of the president and the role of the Congress. But instead, they get mired down in this picky detail. And just an example of that picky detail, as far as his speeches go. Well, we have a video of the January 6th speech from Trump, but the only thing they had as evidence of Johnson's speeches were the stenographers had been recording the speech. So they had hours of debate about whether or not the stenographer's symbols could have accurately recorded the speeches. Hours of debate, and then hours of debate about whether or not certain witnesses could give testimony. And there was a tremendous amount of inconsistency here with what is hearsay and what isn't hearsay and who can speak and who can't speak. The first couple of days of the trial, the galleries are packed, but as time rolls on, fewer and fewer people are showing up. It's like, come on, people, this is getting boring. Let's move on. In his closing argument here that John Bingham gives, he says, I ask you to consider that we stand this day pleading for the violated majesty of the law by the graves of 500,000 martyred hero patriots who made death beautiful by the sacrifice of themselves for their country, the Constitution, and the laws, and who, by their sublime example, have taught us that all must obey the law, that none are above the law. Before man and God, he is guilty, and everybody just stood up and cheered wildly, and yes, he nailed it. That's what we want. The man is guilty here. Now, Ivan Stanberry here who is doing a closing argument for the defense. And I just included this because if I were on trial and my attorney stood up and started it off like this, I would kind of wonder. Stanberry had actually been ill and he missed a lot of the trial. So he just drags his barely recovered body back to the Senate in order to deliver his closing. And begins, "The flesh indeed is weak, the spirit is willing. Unseen and friendly hands seem to support me. Voices inaudible to all others, I hear or seem to hear. They whisper words of consolation, of hope, of confidence," and on. I don't know, that would worry me. But anyway, he does eventually get around to his defense of Johnson. He says, you know, from Washington on, presidents and Congress have occasionally been in fierce and bitter antagonisms. You know what? It has happened. We can't impeach for that. He said the framers meant for impeachment to be used as a remedy for a great mischief when nothing but the removal of the chief magistrate could save the nation. But they never meant it for this sort of a party purpose. He also said this is degrading the Senate to have this trial here. And then he also said, hey, folks, where's the great mischief? Stanton's still barricaded in his office. He's still the acting Secretary of War. So why are we impeaching on something as trivial as this? He also said that, you know, to test the constitutionality of this law. He quotes Thomas Jefferson here, when Thomas Jefferson had addressed this issue of, do only judges get to test the constitutionality of laws? Jefferson had said, certainly there is not a word in the Constitution which has given that power to them more than to the executive or legislative branches. And of course, Andrew Jackson, the great wielder of the veto and violator of the Constitution, had said, the Congress, the executive, and the court must each for itself be guided by its own opinion of the Constitution. And then back to those speeches, he says, you know, it is in the name of all the people of the United States that you senators are in this article called upon to hold the President of the United States criminally responsible, even to the loss of his office, for speaking with a loud voice to assemblages of American citizens. This is freedom of speech. Did you hear that one recently? He can give any kind of a speech he wants because he is protected by the freedom of speech. You know, I suppose now that we're moving into the vote, we may as well chat for a moment about Edmund Ross, because, you know, if anybody knows anything at all about the impeachment trial, you know it from Kennedy's book, Profiles in Ghostwriters. Well, I think it's really widely known now that although Kennedy came up with the idea for the book and he authorized the book and he may have made a few notes for the book, he in fact did not write the book. Fine, because after all, a lot of politicians and celebrities, they do have ghostwriters who write their books for them. But when you go ahead and you accept the Pulitzer Prize for having written a book that was written by others, I think we've got some questionable ethics there. Anyway, so this is what Kennedy said about Ross. In a lonely grave, forgotten and unknown, lies the man who saved a president, as though that president need be saved, and who as a result may well have preserved for ourselves and posterity constitutional government in the United States. Yes, the man who performed in 1868 what one historian has called the most heroic act in American history. Yes, incomparably more difficult than any deed of valor upon the field of battle. Line them all up, and Ross is at the head of that line, but a United States senator whose name no one recalls, Edmund G. Ross of Kansas. Well, as Paul Harvey used to say, this is the rest of the story. Ross, who was a complete nobody. Nobody ever noticed anything he ever did, and those were even the people that watched the Senate very, very closely. He came from Kansas, and you know, this was at a time we're moving into the latter half of the 19th century, where political corruption, it is the national pastime, and there was, you know, the cities were all run by corrupt political machines, and one of the most corrupt of all the political machines was Kansas. And it was pretty well known that that his sponsor, this guy by the name of Perry Fuller, had paid $42,000 in bribes to have Ross appointed to the Senate. And this was after a senator who had been discovered that Fuller had paid $20,000 in bribes to get him into the Senate, had committed suicide. Every single day leading up to the trial and the vote, Ross pledged, absolutely, I am going to vote for conviction. Now, he gets credited in Kennedy's book because, in fact, as they called the roll in alphabetical order, he is the 7th Republican to vote not guilty. But in fact, there were other Republicans who were ready to vote not guilty. So Ross's role really not that important as Kennedy played it out to be. Of course, after Johnson's was acquitted in this trial, Ross decides to, to pull in, his thank you notes from Johnson, and he asked that his friend Fuller be appointed to as commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, where, my gosh, his corruption could flow through the country. The Senate refused to confirm. Ross set his sights a little bit lower then, and he had his friend Fuller appointed as collector of revenue in the port of New Orleans, one of the most a real hornet's nest of corruption here. Fuller immediately doubled the number of employees. He had all the Republicans fired and he replaced them with Democrats. He was ultimately arrested for stealing $3 million. Ross posted his bond. Kennedy said of all of the men who voted for acquittal for Johnson, that not a single one of them escaped the terrible torture of vicious criticism engendered by their vote to acquit. Well, that is also actually not true. Although Ross did lose re-election, his career was fine after that. He published a number of newspapers, and he went on to be territorial governor of New Mexico. And he was also pretty much in charge of all the patronage jobs in Kansas and the Western and the Indian territories. So much for his profile in courage here. So let's look at the vote. Stanton, he said coming up right to the day, May 15th, that the success of impeachment is certain here. They decided that they were going to vote on the 11th article first, because that was the one that most people thought that it was most likely to win conviction, because there were all those things bundled in, into one article. The thought was, well, some people will like point A, some people like point B, some people like point C. And so if we add up A, B, and C together, then we're going to get conviction here. That Article 11, it was all about how he had disregarded Congress and had not faithfully executed the laws. Coming into that vote, they really didn't know how the vote was going to go. They were unsure about some of the Republican votes. So I'd like to spend a minute and just look here at some of these Republicans that did vote not guilty, and we can wonder maybe why they did. First of all, there was Joseph Fowler. He was a Republican who voted not guilty. He had said right up until he cast his vote that if we refuse to impeach Andrew Johnson from office, the blood of loyal men slain in the South will rest upon our souls. However, there were rumors that he might be engaged to, if not carrying on, a little bit of a friendship with Andrew Johnson's daughter. So maybe that influenced his vote. There was John Henderson. He was a Republican. He was engaged to a very outspoken Democrat. So maybe a little pillow talk might have swayed his vote. There was Waitman Wiley. He was a former slaveholder. He had opposed the Freedmen's Bureau. However, right up until the moment of the vote, he had also pledged to vote for conviction. And of course, Edmund Ross, he had said right up until he cast the vote that he would indeed vote for conviction. Well, they came one vote short. and not just because of Ross's vote, because there was another Republican that came after him. And they said that there were a couple of other Republicans that if, you know, the vote wasn't, if they didn't hit the magic number 7, that other Republicans had already been bought. And, you know, that the rumors were swirling right around to the galleries. Oh, Ross has been bought and Fowler's been bought. And so immediately after the vote for acquittal on the 11th article, and that was the one that was really, everybody thought was going to get him, that the prosecution said, can you give us more time, please, we need more time. But, you know, at this point, nobody really believes that more time is going to change anything. And so that motion was defeated. Andrew Johnson's bodyguard got up from his seat and ran all the way down Pennsylvania Avenue to deliver the news to Johnson that he had won acquittal. And as a friend of Thaddeus Stevens said, what in the name of what's honest is the matter with our party? History will record that Andrew Johnson was convicted by the country, though it will be compelled to relate how he escaped the consequences of his crime through the weakness of dishonored senators. So there we have the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, the legacy of this event. It certainly is hard to convict. Seems to be getting a little bit easier to impeach, but seems to be a lot harder to convict. I was hoping to have more time here to hear your comments, but I'm willing to hang in there as long as Meg is for us to discuss our whatever questions or comments that you would like to make.